Assalamu alaikum
Assalamu
warahmatullahi
alaikum
wabarakatuh.
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. This is Waritha Zainab and you're watching Aagahi. Often you must have heard this statement from people that they love you because you're always there for them, or they love you because you are somebody who will never say no to them, and you.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to another episode of Aagahi with your host Waritha Zainab. How often do you get a gut feeling about something and you ignore it? How often do you get a really strong intuition about someone or something in a certain situation and you just don't pay attention to it, and later on you regret it? Mind, body, and soul are inseparable. There are so many things that we experience from birth till adulthood that we may not remember, but it stays in our subconscious mind. And it often comes up as a form of illness or a certain strong emotion that we're unable to understand. Today's episode, we're going to talk about a really interesting therapy and approach that promotes healing by being present in the moment. It's called Compassionate Inquiry. We're going to welcome our guest, Xavier, who is a compassionate inquiry practitioner and educator, and he will talk to us about the link that we have between the body, mind, and the heart, and how trauma shapes our personalities. Xavier, welcome to Aagahi.
Hi, Warisa. Hi, everyone.
So good to have you.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
So, Xavier, we're going to talk about compassionate inquiry, but first of all, I'm interested to know what you do as a practitioner and what kind of therapies do you practice before you started your journey as a compassionate inquirer.
Sure, absolutely. So really, my original profession started in a very different space in the corporate world. Investment banking, entrepreneurship, that sort of thing. And very slowly I started to realize that actually there was this curiosity of mine that I couldn't quite quench. And it happened to be everything to do around psychology. And so I started to just devour everything that I possibly could. And specifically, it was Gabor's work that I found particularly interesting, that had a wonderful message to it. And just encapsulated an approach, as you mentioned, right? A psychoanalytic approach that almost means that you can bring in a lot of different modalities into it, whether it's DBT, CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, schema therapy, internal family systems, but it just does it in this approach, which means that you're typically being very present, or you're always being very present and attuned to the client. And at the same time, you're giving space to really try and understand what's behind, what's the root cause of what the presenting issue is. Yeah.
So currently you're practicing different kinds of therapeutic interventions for your clients, including DBT. So how does compassionate inquiry come in? How does that help with your clients?
Well, let's see. So I suppose what I would say is that compassionate inquiry is very much an approach. Right? It is a way of practicing or running a session, almost like a protocol, if you will. Right? It's not necessarily strict in any way, but it's suggestive as to what tends to work quite well. And so with some clients, you'll start off having a conversation, and what you'll realize is that they're quite disconnected from themselves. And so before you can even get really into what you might otherwise term as, capital T or small t trauma, there's a connection to establish between the client, or you might call them a patient, and themselves. And so the initial sessions are very much about getting them to feel their body, perhaps in a way that they haven't felt their body either ever or for a very long time. Right? And so one of the messages that Gabor highlights quite often is that trauma, again, whether it's big trauma or small trauma, isn't so much the event that happens, but what happens to you, inside you, right? And so two people could experience exactly the same event one person is traumatized, one person isn't. Right? And so ultimately that trauma is a disconnection from yourself. And so, we as practitioners will bump into clients where that disconnection is so severe that it takes a few sessions to actually help them reconnect and understand what they're feeling, what the sensations are like, because it's just been so severed. Yeah.
You mentioned disconnection with oneself. How does that even happen? Because most of us, we feel we are connected. We know ourselves. We know what's going on. We feel we are in control. But you said
Sure.
people are often disconnected. How does that happen?
Perhaps an analogy might help. So if you think of where your focus and your attention is at this present moment, right? It's in certain places, and it's definitely not in other places, right? So my attention is here with you. The messages that we're sharing between us. It is not in what I was doing yesterday. My attention is not in what was happening, at this date last year. And so in a similar sort of way, we can get distracted and lose that connection to ourselves by being very busy and having to be hyper aware of what's happening around us, because actually, what the trauma did for us was put us in a very hyper vigilant state where we're always having to watch out for what threat could be coming our way, right? And in that busyness of having to do that, we've become very used to not checking with ourselves and being grounded and making sure that we're getting and that we're providing, whatever it might be that we need. And so really it's that shift of attention and focus that we lose with ourselves, and it becomes so habitual that we don't even notice that we've done it.
And when does this start? From childhood or later in adult life?
I mean, ultimately it can start whenever the event, the trauma kicks in.
Right.
And what does happen a fair bit is that, you'll be with a client and they'll be talking about, an issue that they have, and they'll be describing the situation. And, one of the questions that you might ask as a practitioner is this a familiar feeling? Have you experienced this? Have you perceived things like this before? And they might say, actually, yes, absolutely. And they might bring in childhood, or they might bring in school, or they might bring in situations with their siblings. And so what you realize is that actually in making space for that link to be made, it's not always the case, but it is sometimes the case that the reason that the client is interpreting the world today and the events today the way that they are is because actually it's just an echo of the past. And until that echo, that original root has been, opened up, cleaned, held space for, there is this temptation and this propensity to interpret a lot of things the same way, right? And so, for example, there might be, cases of people feeling that, other people are against them all the time, or that there are severe injustices that are happening to them all the time at every workplace that they go to, or that there are, this propensity for romantic partners to always abandon them, that sort of thing. And so in evaluating these things, you're able to actually connect it to something much sooner. And it's at that point that you can actually start to bring in compassion, understanding. Because the reality is that, the adult part of us can understand a lot, right? We can, and in a way, when we say adult part, it's the part of us that can actually bring our frontal cortex and have it engaged to evaluate the situation. But actually what happens particularly when we're younger, is that it's more primal parts of our brain that are engaged. And so, for example, for a child to feel an emotion, let's say fear, it is not just a question of not wanting to feel it. It is a significant fear that if you feel it, it is the only thing that will exist, and it will last forever, right? And there is no end to it. And so it's not so much that it's this, what an adult part of you might say, oh, this is very simple, just feel this. It's the child in you, typically, that is perceiving it as something that will kill you. And so do not connect with that sensation, do not connect with that emotion. And so part of the work is to almost, create that safe harbor for us to be able to open that up in a very safe way, slowly but surely. Ultimately, the client being the guide, the client setting the pace, and us as practitioners really only reflecting back what we're noticing, what we're seeing.
How is this different to other forms of therapy? Because surely compassion is the most important element in a therapeutic relationship where, as a therapist, you provide a safe environment for your client to open up.
Sure.
So
Well, it's, like any good therapy session, you'll notice that it is a session where you're incredibly present with the client, and so there will be times when you're not following, or a lot of the time you're not following a script. You're not telling yourself, "Oh, this has happened. Now I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do that." Because in trying to do that, you're almost removing yourself from being connected to your client, right? And it almost insinuates that you have an agenda as to where you think things should go. Where the reality is, the client knows themselves better than you do, than as practitioners we ever could, and to a big extent, they're the ones that know the way out, not us. And so having an agenda, thinking that there is a protocol to follow, isn't something we necessarily do. It is in having practiced and rehearsed and done so many training hours that we can just be incredibly present and let what surfaces come up, and for us to let that happen. So, for example, to the point where if we might be feeling something, it is important for us to bring it into the session, whether it's our own issue or whether it's something that we're simply sensing, because it could be something known as countertransference, right, where the client doesn't want to feel something, and so they are unconsciously projecting it out. And so our ability as practitioners to be able to sense, hey, I'm feeling something, it's important for us to bring it up so that we can distinguish, is this my stuff as a practitioner, or is it something that I'm sensing that the client is bringing up? Right? So openness, clarity, making everything okay and not making anything wrong is an important part of the qualities of the therapeutic relationship. And the other thing that I would say is that, and so to answer your question, yes, compassionate inquiry is an approach. You recognize it when you apply it and when you use it, and when you see other people bring it up. But a good session will beg, borrow, and steal from any other modality because it's the right thing to do. Right? It's what is justified in the session.
you mentioned something really interesting, and I've had this question for a very long time. Members of the same family, say for example 5 siblings who were raised by the same parents, who shared the same experience, grew up in the same environment by the same parents, but they form different personalities as they grow up. And in regards to trauma, say for example, if the entire family was subjected to the same kind of traumatic experience, loss of a loved one, or a natural disaster, a man-made disaster, it could be anything. Why is it that, like you said, one sibling may end up becoming traumatized for life, while the other one can continue to live a trauma-free life?
Yeah. Ultimately, it's there's a myriad of answers to it. However, there is one fundamental truth, which is, or even fact, which is that no two things are ever exactly the same. Right? If you are the first child, your parents were experienced differently in how to be a parent than if you were the second child. Right? That fact alone is a huge variable. The second fact is that if you have a sibling, you experience the world differently than if you were the first child or the only child. And so to say that, oh, we're part of the same family, therefore we're the same, is unfortunately just incredibly incorrect. The relationship you have with your sibling is important. The geography that you're living in is important. To bring in Gabor, he was born in 1944. He was having to evade the Nazis in Hungary, and so that tension, that stress existed in his emotional environment, even as a toddler. And so those are things that you can't easily replicate because someone else was born in the US in 1944. And so that would be the main reason why making such comparisons are incorrect. The other thing is that, quite simply, we're programmed differently, and we're each in a very different vantage point. And so we will perceive things differently and notice things that someone else doesn't notice.
That's a brilliant point. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. I was going to bring in the point you brought about compassion. And so to really just to highlight that actually there are different levels of compassion, right? And so that's why compassion can be so powerful, because as someone's telling you something, there might be ordinary compassion, which is somebody's suffering, and you can be compassionate about it. You understand it. You feel bad about it, right? To take a very trivial example, let's assume someone's had a parking ticket. Right? We all know what that's like, and so we can empathize about what that might sort of mean. The next type of compassion is one of understanding, where you're curious about why the person is suffering, and now you're able to understand it, and that quality of compassion is slightly different, but it adds to the original type of compassion. There's another type of compassion, which is this idea of truth, and helping people find that truth almost becomes a compassion, a type of compassion that just feels very settling, because the client and you're no longer having to run around trying to understand things, right? You've got to the truth, and there's a settling that comes out of it. There's then a different type of compassion that comes up sometimes, which is one of recognition, which is as a practitioner, I get it, right? I can see myself in your shoes. That there's nothing that's true about you, the client, that isn't true about all of us, all the rest of us, right? And I suppose the final part of compassion that I would highlight is, the sense of, in spite of the past, there is still so much opportunity ahead of us. As long as we have a pulse, as long as we're still breathing, as long as we're still, alive, there is so much possibility. That when you get to that level of compassion, the narrative has been reframed, and there's a lot of renewed energy that comes into the conversation.
One of the things you talked about is sometimes people get into, say, for example, defensive mode, where
Sure.
if they're exposed to certain situations or circumstances in life where they're subjected to something, they automatically go into that defensive mode by default without, like you said, being in the moment, being present, understanding what's going on, and then later on they might reflect on it and think, why did I react like that to this person or the situation? I don't understand why that happened. I could have handled it differently, or I could have said something else, or maybe chose to remain silent, but I reacted out of fear or insecurities. And you gave an interesting example of Gabor being a toddler and being separated from his caregiver, from his mother, and how that affected him later on. Even if the child doesn't have a memory as early as that, it's somewhere inside. If you could explain that concept a bit.
Yeah. So, and again, tell me if this sounds accurate. But what I'm hearing is this idea of the triggers that we carry as individuals, and these are emotional triggers that, as soon as they are even, hinted at, can cause a reaction, right? It's endless, the amount of triggers that we can hold. and why wouldn't it be, right? The human experience is such a wide kaleidoscope. Um, you know, um, and I mean, sure, you could say that there are buckets, right? Anything that threatens your identity, anything that threatens your belief system, but ultimately, it's that. It is a perceived sense of of I guess a boundary being breached. That means that we go from zero to reaction without really pausing or being able to pause to really assess what has actually happened. There's automatic interpretation. There is automatic perception of what's happened and who did what and how it happened and why and intent. Right? There's a lot of projection that will happen relatively quickly, and so all of that happens at the speed of light, and it all makes sense to us in our personalized experience, and it comes out as a reaction, right? And it's only and it can be triggered by the fundamental emotion can be fear, anger, sadness, you name it. But ultimately, the important thing to realize is that we all carry a lot of these triggers, and whenever one might notice a defense mechanism come up, it is an opportunity to inquire and to say, "Oh, why am I feeling triggered? Right? What's that about? Right? Why am I feeling? Why is my self-confidence hurt a bit? Why am I feeling a little insecure? Why am I offended by what that person has said?" And so, really, it's the beauty is in taking that responsibility, right? And really, it's our ability to respond, right? Taking that responsibility to say, "Oh, what a wonderful gift that someone's given me by triggering me. I now know that there's something that I should focus on. That otherwise, I will be on autopilot for the rest of my life, right? Or there will be topics that I just simply cannot approach because every time they're approached, I can only see it in this particular slant of view."
How can you know your authentic self? Because we spoke earlier on about being disconnected from ourselves. How can we build that connection? How can I get to know my authentic self?
Now, I don't know whether this is super relevant, but one of the things that I would certainly highlight is that there is a difference between your authentic self and getting things right. Your authentic self, in a way, is one that doesn't need to be judged. It is outside of the boundary of judgment, of ranking, of whether it's social, societal. There are no norms that your authentic self needs to fit into. Right? It is quite simply a full expression of what you are, who you choose to be, and what is happening for you in the moment. Right? The difficulty comes when we are in environments that potentially clash with who we would rather be authentically, and particularly in the sessions that we run in psychology, you get a lot of almost trade-offs that need to happen, right? Particularly with regards between authenticity and connection, right? That for me to remain in this family, for me to remain in this friendship group, for me to remain in this corporation, I need to go along with what is the norm, what is traditional, what is expected. And therefore, I need to curb who I am, because otherwise I will be kicked out. Right? I will be abandoned, or whatever story you might make. And so this tension to our authenticity is something, unfortunately, that happens to us all the time, every year, every week, every month. But there is a way to become so attuned to the trade-offs that we're making that we get to make a more informed choice about, actually, I would rather be authentic than be different and risk disconnection. And so what that means, particularly when it comes to, we might have experienced it a lot through COVID, is you get to say, actually, as much as I'd love to go to that dinner, I just don't want to. And that's okay. Right? There are a lot more elements of self-care that can come in, where you're listening to your authentic self, as opposed to, what people do when they're growing up a lot is actually, I need the world to approve of me, because in a way it's kind of what we encourage kids to do. Prove yourself, do what you can, be the best that you can be, reach your potential. And so in a way we're encouraging them to push themselves. And there is a point in life where we need to actually realize, okay, I've always been enough, but now I need to stop thinking that actually that approval comes from external, right? And so bridging that gap between authenticity and connection can be one of those ways of being more authentic.
So what you're doing is you're kind of relying on your own emotions of what you like and what you don't, and what you're not comfortable with, rather than thinking about what others perceive of you, or whether getting somebody's approval is more important than whether you're comfortable with it or not.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's no easy task, in the sense that it's complicated to know what you want in a way that actually is what you want, in the context of everything else you want in life. Right? So there's what you might want impulsively, and there's what you might want 5 days from now, right? And so to navigate those waters, it really helps to have had a wonderful childhood where these decisions were modeled for you, right? And so it's not just a question of being selfish and not thinking about others. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It's learning to do trade-offs that sometimes feel really uncomfortable, and sometimes feel like ethical dilemmas. Right? I want to do this for myself, but I also want to do this for others, and how do you manage that in a way that you're okay with? And so the idea, for example, of civility is a wonderful way to approach a topic like this, because in a way civility is, how do I interact in a way that is best for me, while maintaining a boundary of self-care, health, love, and all the rest of it, but that also means I bring the utmost respect to other people. I'm conscious of their time, of their space, of even their most subtle of no's, right? I will listen to that and be okay with that. I will not bring my own issues into them for them to carry. And so there are ways of navigating this, but it's not as easy as I would simply do what I feel like doing when I feel like doing it. It is still complicated.
You mentioned setting boundaries, and this is so important, especially when it comes to interpersonal relationships, whether it's with your family members, loved ones, co-workers. Tell us more about this, about the importance of setting boundaries and the consequences or the impact of not setting boundaries.
Sure. Now, again, boundaries, wonderful topic, a very big topic, and we're going to get better with time. Right? But for example, a very good boundary doesn't need to hold tension. Right? It is, a boundary is almost hey, here's a line. Choose to cross it or not. Either way, I know where I stand with regards to this line. If you cross it, then I know what I need to do. Right? So actually, there's no need for a boundary to hold tension or to hold high charge of emotion. Right? Another analogy that I would use is that a boundary isn't necessarily a fence that you're trying to hold and that you're putting energy into. It is almost a little bit like a trough that is so deep that as soon as someone walks into it, that's it. It just, there's no more tension. It's been crossed, and you know what the consequences are. Right? Now, what can be tricky is believing that you set a boundary, but actually it's not a practical boundary, and so you're having to renegotiate it. Right? Or not realizing that you're dealing with someone that's very good at making you rethink what you've decided, and therefore, again, moving the boundary. Right? And again, it's getting the boundary right can be tricky. Because it's not a question of actually I'm going to isolate myself in my tower
Yeah.
and not let anything in. Because at that point, sure, you're very safe, you're very protected, but you're experiencing a tiny piece of the spectrum of what it is to live. And at the same time, it's not about being so selfless that you let everyone engage with you in any way that they choose to. And so getting a sense for what the right boundary is across a variety of topics in and of itself is a tricky thing, right? In the same way that, again, forgive me for using analogies, but how much salt do you actually want in your dinner, right? It's a very personal choice, and what works for you may not work for someone else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's true. Is there any relationship between experiencing trauma in the past, or even if you're going through it in your present life, and forming addictions?
I mean, there's certainly a link, right? Now, I suppose the first thing that I would say is the idea of addictions, and Gabor mentions this a lot, is addictions don't have to be illegal for them to be addictions, right? There are a lot of legal addictions that we all take part in. I mean, I was addicted to work. I was addicted to exercise, and really the definition that we want to bring into this is ultimately that it's anything that you cannot stop yourself from doing, in spite of having evidence that actually it is bringing you more pain than good. Right? It is making your life less by doing it. And it's compulsive, or it can be compulsive. It's illogical. It is very much a crutch, and so I suppose linking it to trauma, what I would say is, if you can connect with that inner child in you that is so afraid of accepting a reality, or of noticing something, or of feeling something, because it might last forever and it might be infinite, you can understand why people would choose an addiction as a form of escape, as a form of relief, and all the beautiful things that the addiction originally starts off as being able to provide. Right? When you speak to people about their addictions and you ask them, what does it do for you? You realize actually they're wonderful things. It brings connection, it brings peace, it brings rest, it brings, in all its different forms. And so none of those things are necessarily bad at all. Quite the opposite. They're ways of self-medicating, of self-soothing. Right? And so the question is, and, as Gabor often says, it's not why the addiction, it's why the pain. Right? What is it that's causing you to focus so much on the addiction? And the unfortunate reality is that we tend to keep what's most difficult later in life. And so, what you've spent all your life running away from, that you're now having to look at, is the hardest thing you have ever had to deal with.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's addiction is not always about using substance, but addictive behavior, like being a workaholic, or like you gave your own example, you were addicted to exercise. And I'm sure each one of us has some kind of addictive behavior or habit that we feel we can't stop, and it gives us something, whether it's peace, contentment, pleasure, calmness. Xavier, you spoke about a lot of things, and it's such a broad subject, like this compassionate inquiry, because I can see this approach being used across different, sectors where people communicate with other people, other human beings. But living in the UK, in the United Kingdom, there's this approach. For example, if I go to a GP or a specialist, they will only focus on the presenting problem, like one problem at a time, maximum 5 minutes to address that. And their approach would be maybe to just prescribe a pain medication or an antidepressant, which is commonly seen, and I see this over and over again, that people are suffering in their real lives and they're carrying so much baggage from their past. I personally haven't come across a single client in my life who hasn't experienced any form of trauma. Everybody has
Sure.
experienced something.
Yeah.
But not every specialist, not every practitioner practices compassion or empathy. It's of most I mean, sometimes it's mostly about, oh, just prescribe something, get it over and done with. Let's deal with the presenting pain and not why the pain is there or where it's coming from.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And so forgive me. What's the question?
So, like, it's just something I'm sharing, like putting across, like
Hmm.
this happens on a daily basis. And
Hmm.
I feel, and I'm sure you have seen this in your own practice as well, that
Yeah, for
I'm
sure.
sure people come to you where they are suffering from some kind of chronic pain, an illness, an ailment. But when you talk to them and you find out that it's originating from an experience,
Hmm.
something that they don't want to talk about anymore, something they want to avoid, something that has been suppressed over the years. But if they actually address that root cause of the problem that's causing that pain, that's manifesting itself in the form of an illness, things become easier to manage.
Hmm.
Isn't that so?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I would even add to that the systems that have been built to provide these services are based with very different metrics in mind, and so therefore the whole process, the whole experience is is tailored with with a very different mindset, right? So, for example, in the corporate world, which includes doctors and the rest of it, profit is still a necessity. Not because it's bad. It's just that if you don't make a profit or at least break even, you cannot justify continuing the initiative, right? Unless you have a benefactor that provides charity and funds and endowment, perhaps, and that sort of thing, right? But the reality is, funds are required for these wonderful institutions to exist, right? And so there has been an initial sort of emergence of this KPI focused, process driven, low empathy, low customer focus sort of institutions that have been built. But the opportunity, as you highlight now, is to say, hey, maybe there's a reallocation of resources here if we were to bring in softer metrics so that, perhaps it's profit first, okay, but then people very quickly as a second metric, right? And then perhaps actually, let's not stop there. Let's bring in the environment as an immediate third metric, right? And you're starting to see that where environmental sort of sustainability goals are becoming really, really important for the public markets, for investors, for them to be able to justify the funds that they get into. Because if they can invest in a company that makes profit, but it is also good for the environment, the money will quite simply flow to the one that is also good for the environment as well as making a profit. And so in a similar way, if a company is able to show in our industry that they are that much more effective while being able to maintain the levels of profit that investors are used to, that's when we're going to start to see that shift.
And we can see that compassion is something which can be used in daily life with with different kinds of circumstances or situations that we come across, and it's not something that can only be confined to a therapeutic setting, but I'm sure it's something that can be applied personally as well. What about self-compassion, Xavier?
Oh, self-compassion is a beautiful topic, and actually there is a wonderful American lady. I'm going to butcher her name, but I think she's done TED Talk. She's written a book called, I think, Self-Compassion, and the reason self-compassion is incredibly important is that there are moments, perhaps the most difficult of moments, when you as an individual will feel and experience the world as very lonely. And it is in those moments that you get to almost have that conversation with yourself about what's happening for you, what you're perceiving, what you're making things mean, right? And there is only so much tension we can hold before it's just the amygdala, the reptile brain that is functioning, and we can't engage with the cortex because the cortex takes, I think it's 30 times slower to actually come online. And so if it's hijacked by the very primitive emotional brain, then actually there's no chance that we will see things accurately, right? We will make assumptions, right? And so self-compassion can allow you, on a scale of 0 to 10, to say, hey, I'm currently at an 8 out of 10. I know myself enough to know that I will not be productive in this conversation or in what I'm doing. So I shouldn't be driving, I shouldn't be talking to anyone. I need to take time for myself, calm myself down, regulate myself. And so as a starting point, I would say identifying when we're triggered and taking time for ourselves is a very helpful first habit to notice, right? In theory, we should always have that human right of taking a few minutes, right? The next phase is how are we actually there for ourselves, right? And actually, if you think about how children are nurtured, there are dialogues that the parent will have with the child. There are, so for example, if one child says to another something quite mean, you can imagine a parent coming in and banishing that type of language from the conversation and saying, hey, that's not okay. It is not how we talk to people, right? We bring respect and all the rest of it. There are other times when there might be conflict between two kids, and it's a question of, okay, hey, we can figure this out. Let's negotiate it, right? There are other times when a child, you can see they are doing something, and you want to make sure that you nurture that curiosity, that inclination to do things, right? And so, in a way, it is, how can you be the best parent for yourself? And that is where self-compassion can come in, right? To say, hey, whatever narrative it is that you're telling yourself, bringing in that adult part, just to almost be that in-between manager to say, hey, is this fair, right? Let's bring some compassion here.
This example you gave just now about being compassionate with yourself, and if you feel that you are not in the mood for having a conversation with someone or going for a drive, saying no to people. But don't you feel people who have been exposed to traumatic family environment, where they were abused as a child, or they were raised by a parent or a caregiver who was really overly strict and used harsh language or harsh methods of parenting for the child, and now that person as an adult finds it difficult to say no to others? It's like a fear that is inside, that if I say no to this person, they're going to get angry, they're going to get raged, they're going to get upset. So it's all these assumptions, they're kind of resurfacing from an emotion that's inside, associated with your past. Does trauma impact relationships?
Yeah, Warisa, you're bringing up a wonderful topic, which is that none of this is simple. It is embedded in a web of context, of history, of habits, of neurological pathways that have been set up from your youth, and it is in no way an easy task to do this. At the very least, in certain circumstances, and it's incredibly important for people to appreciate that. There are times when even just taking a breath is the hardest thing that you could ever ask someone to do, right? Absolutely. Because the world is just that heavy, right? Now, I suppose looking at the flip side of that, the reality is that everything typically starts with awareness. Becoming aware that something's not right, that something could be better, right, is typically step one. in this particular example that you highlighted of, people are interdependent, they're interconnected, and so saying no could make things worse and all the rest of it. There's elements where it's financial independence, right? And actually, there's only so much you can do before that becomes a possibility for you. But there, in the realm of psychology, there is this very big topic of codependence. There's this wonderful author and practitioner called Pierre Melody, and I'd certainly recommend the book to people. That as much as one may not want to label oneself as codependent, the opposite is secure, independent, an ability to be interdependent with people. And I can tell you that from my experience, it's actually very hard to be the opposite. That if anything, it's so easy to be codependent, right? Because life can be stumbling sometimes, and so the practice of not being codependent, even when you have a good start in life, is difficult, right? But the beauty is that with people like Pierre, there are maps, there are ways of understanding the elements involved in that. And so, for example, what might typically happen in the childhood development is that the parent doesn't quite understand that children are valuable, regardless of what they can produce. That children are, impulsive, right? It can trigger some people, some parents, that actually children are impulsive, and there's a kaleidoscope of things that kids can do, and kids will trigger us all the time, and so as a parent, rightly or wrongly, there is this relationship that gets established, and regrettably, it is rarely as healthy as we would like to think it is. Which means that these traits and these habits and these ways of interacting with other humans gets carried on later in life. We find ourselves in these relationships that are actually quite intertwined and difficult, because actually we rely on the other person to help us with other aspects of life that we have difficulty dealing with ourselves, and so we can't leave. Even if we had the opportunity to, it's just emotionally, existentially, it's very impossible to even contemplate having a different life. And so, but the beauty, as I say, is that particularly with an approach with compassionate inquiry, is that you can bring in all these different modalities and really be present with what's happening in the present.
And I can understand how difficult that must be for clients to acknowledge and to actually face, because I get to hear this so much from people that I've been like this all my life, or this is how I've done it, this is how I do it. And I think this is one of the most dangerous phrases in the world, when you feel that just because I've been doing something like this all my life, I need to continue doing it. They're afraid of change. They're afraid of growth. They're afraid of coming out of their comfort zones, even if that means compromising on self-care, compromising on their well-being. And yeah, it's hard. We only have a few minutes, so yeah, go on.
The one thing I would highlight actually is focusing on the motivation of the patient can be very helpful at that time. Because if they're having a conversation with you, it is because actually there is a pain that they are trying to resolve. There is momentum there that you can work with as a practitioner. And so all these defenses that they're giving you, all these reasons that they're giving you, are valid. But what is also true is that there's another part of them that wants things to change. Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left, so if you would like to share your final thoughts, words of wisdom.
Let's see. Hey, I would say that it's a wonderful journey to embark on getting to know yourself and one's psychology. It is a wonderful topic that not only makes your life better, but actually it makes your interactions with other people that much better. I would certainly advise people to, if there is an interest, to actually dig into it, because it will, yield benefits, and the benefits only get better the more time goes by. So I would say feel free to tug at that curiosity. Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Xavier, for this amazing discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And for all our lovely viewers who are watching this program, if there's anything you would like to ask Xavier about compassionate inquiry, if you are interested in becoming a compassionate inquiry therapist yourself, or if you are experiencing trauma of any sort and you require help, please feel free to call in our studio and we'll be more than happy to connect you with Xavier. And we'll join you again next Saturday with another guest and another topic around your mental health and your psychological well being, because your mind and your body is inseparable. Thank you so much, Xavier, once again. Really, really appreciate having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
All right. Bye. Assalamu